working with warped fabric is not impossible, it's just very time consuming. This would be extremely easy and quick to sew up if you're working with regular fabric, but I'm working with a warped fabric that I had. It is a thick but soft yet sturdy knit that would absolutely stand the test of time, unlike other knits that tend to stretch out and lose their shape in the wash. So I went ahead and worked with it anyway. You just have to understand the shape of your fabric once it's warped. I liken it to working on the bias, except you're not working on the bias. To start with, I do this with all my fabric. I square it off. However, it becomes even more important to square that off once you're working with something that is warped. And I do not suggest this for larger items that require bigger pieces. So I use the vertical ridges to cut the lengthwise grain, and then I use the tiny dots along the crosswise grain to cut on that. In order for this to work, you have to really be in tune with your fabric. And what I mean by that is when you're cutting, you can actually hear the sound is different and you will know that you're going off grain. For this sleeve, I split it into two pieces and added seam allowance. This way I have greater control over the fabric and its warpedness, and when worn it would sit on and move with the arm the way it's supposed to. I would definitely recommend warp fabric for sleeves because they give the natural curve to the arm that pattern technicians like myself replicate with dots. I stretched what would become the two front pieces. I stretched them into a shape that was as similar as possible, and then I cut out the pattern. Getting them to similar sizes was extremely frustrating because I had to use my iron to shrink and stretch some parts of the fabric. I repeated this process for the two back pieces of the sleeve, and I ended up shaping the sleeve a tiny bit more afterwards. For the front piece, I cut a square the length and breadth of the whole pattern. Then I folded it in half, lining up all the edges along the straight lines on the cutting mat, and then I cut out the half pattern. I raised the neckline of this pattern about 2 inches because I wanted to create a turtleneck. At the shoulder joints, front and back, I reshaped that because once I raised the neckline, it gave me a weird sort of almond shape. And at this point, I just joined the front and back pieces of the sleeve together using an overlock stitch. Because this fabric is warped, in order to pin it together, I had to do some stretching and tugging here and there, but I just stretch from each end and work my way into the center to pin it. I joined the front and back pieces at the shoulder seams, and then I sewed the side seams. I used the overlock stitch for basically everything, and after completing the shoulder and side seams, I just jumped right into the hem one time. I made the hem by cutting a rectangle that is 5 inches wide by the measurement of the base of the shirt minus 2 inches. Some people would normally iron this in half, but that is not as accurate for me as just sewing it together and then running the iron over it to just flatten out everything. If your hem and cuffs are the same width, it would make sense to cut one long triangle that is the length of all three of those things put together and then split it into three. At this point, I am sewing basically in quarters, stretching the hem to the same length as the shirt and sewing as I go along. And after that, I'm basically going to turn the seam allowance to face upward. So to face towards the neckline, and I'm going to run a zigzag stitch to keep that nice and flat under the shirt. The cuff for the sleeve is 4 inches wide and the length is the cuff length minus 0.5 inch. But I cut mine a little bit too short, so I was really struggling here, as you can see. And of course, it's so important to check to see which way the seam allowance is facing. So at the shoulder seam, we would have faced the seam allowance forward. So that means the seam that I put on the center of the shoulder, that would be on the outer arm, that would be facing backward. So at the wrist, it would be facing backward. So it's important to align the seam allowance at the cuff. Make sure it's facing the opposite direction, so it should be facing forward. This seems a bit confusing, but when you do it, it makes sense. And well, it's just these little fine details that really add a bit of extra professionalism to any piece. And well, at this point, I went ahead and did the neck sort of tube, because it's really just a rectangle sewed together. And well, I think it's so important that in sewing, just as you would measure twice and cut once, that you also pin together your pieces and make sure they're facing the right directions, because I initially pinned this together wrong and then I went on to sewing it wrong and I had to rip out all those stitches and start over. So please make sure to check that your pieces are facing right sides together at all times when you're sewing.